Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast. This is episode 5. I'm your host, Luke Whitaker. Let's jump right back into it and let's go over some of the current events that happened in Japan in the last week in politics. The first thing I'd like to go to is sort of a recurring story we've talked about before on this podcast, which is Japan's essential answer to Trump, which is Governor Saito. He was the former and once again governor of the Hyogo province in Japan. To give you sort of a recap of this story, he was accused of sort of bullying and abusing his power and potentially taking gifts from business leaders. There was a bit of a scandal around that. He was sort of invited to resign. He refused to resign, and then the local prefecture government had a vote and forced him to stand down. And then there was then a runoff election, and he ran sort of a very, what you're being harsh, you would call a post-truth campaign. Some people have called it that, or sort of a quite Trumpian campaign where he sort of stood up for himself and said, no, this is a campaign by the elites to oust me. I've done nothing wrong. There's a sort of an interest in getting rid of me. I'm not being allowed to do my job. I'm trying to represent the people here. And there was a strong social media campaign by him to back that up. And eventually he won. So he's now back in as governor, and which would seem to be, although there's potentially some investigations about his sort of behaviour in the past ongoing, potentially we'll see where that goes. He's back in with a new mandate as governor. You might think that might be the end of the story for a while, but no, it seems this story has the legs to just keep going and going and going, and now there's a new element to this, which apparently his campaign, which of course was successful, he's got back in as governor. There's an allegation that he may have made payments, allegedly, to a PR firm. Basically, in Japan, under the election law there, you're not allowed to directly influence votes by paying others to campaign for you. You're meant to pay just for physical goods like posters, things like that. That's fine. Putting up a poster of your campaign is fine. But the people running it for you, for the most part, are meant to be volunteers. You're not meant to pay people directly to sort of win votes that way. But it appears what happens is, after he won, a PR the company that he's been involved with in the past put up a post claiming that they had a role in sort of handling media relations for him and making some of the campaign videos that he won based on. Now, he's responded by saying, and his lawyers come out and said, that's not accurate. Purely what he did is, though he's been involved with this PR firm in the past, all he's done is paid them for posters and goods. So he's not violating campaign law, is what he claims, even though they did make some videos for his social media campaign. And the YouTuber, the head of the NHK party, Tachibana, he was very pivotal also in him making lots of videos and campaigning for him. He's been very quick to distance himself from this and said, I was not involved in directly campaigning for him. I don't know about any of this. I was just running an independent campaign, despite him sort of running interference for Saito and being very much in favour of him. But he claims he's done nothing wrong. He hasn't broken election law. And the PR firm essentially acted on their own volition to make videos for him. And the payments he made were only for, like I say, those physical goods posters, which are allowed to pay for and then put up. That's fine under Japanese election law. That's what he's claiming. So we'll see what, if anything, further legally comes from this. I mean, this sort of thing seems like it has the legs to just go and go. It's hard to imagine him being forced out by this because he's claiming innocence. And unless there's like a legal resolution, he's before run, like I say, the sort of Trumpian campaign of saying, oh, you know, I can't get a fair shake. It's the elites who are out to get me. I'm just trying to get on with my job. Represent the people. And he's also got like this brand new fresh mandate where he's like comfortably won the election. So you can imagine he'll dig in and refuse to let this affect him, and he'll just try and carry on with his job. And so it's hard to imagine he'll be forced out by this unless there's, like I say, some sort of firm legal resolution to this. Or it could just be this will fizzle out, and there's been a lot of controversy around Saito recently, and this could just be like an aftershake of this. But unless more details come out, or that, like I say, there's some sort of firm legal action, it's hard to imagine he'll be forced out unless something like concrete comes out. But there's a lot of attention on him, a lot of pressure, and so we'll just have to, for the moment, see where that goes. But yeah, I just thought it's interesting that you thought this story perhaps had a conclusion for the moment, and then now he's back in the news. So we'll see what happens to Saito from there. Another interesting story that's come out, we talked sort of about what the response to the situation between China and Trump would be and what Trump election would mean for Japan. We've discussed that in a previous episode. And now it's emerged that the LDP and Ishiba are considering forming what you would call an Asian NATO. That proposal's been floated. Once again, that's been back in the news. And it's sort of interesting. both from the interesting about this is sort of the countries that are included in this proposed Asian NATO, and there's also countries that are very conspicuous by their absence. So just pull up the list of countries involved. I believe the discussed vision for this Asian NATO, it would include the USA, so it'd be interesting if Trump would want to be involved in this potentially, Canada, the UK, France, India, Australia, and Japan, of course, and South Korea, as well as the Philippines. Now, it's interesting. I think the number one thing I was looking for when I saw this story was, would Taiwan be included? Because that would be incredibly significant given what's going on with potentially Ukraine, with China potentially looking to get more aggressive in the sea and claiming territory, and potentially even moving into Taiwan and reclaiming the island. If there was this big lateral movement to include Taiwan in this Asian NATO, that would be very significant, and that would be quite a challenge to China, and very significant, especially if it included the US. Like I say, in the past, Biden has made some quite firm statements on indicating that the US might get physical and get involved if China was to invade Taiwan. Trump hasn't, I believe, taken a clear position on that yet, although he is sort of positioning himself to have a bit of a face-off, at least over tariffs. But it's curious that they're immediately not included in this proposal. There's also a number of other countries that I thought stood out. Vietnam, a large industrial power. Vietnam has been involved in, obviously, defeating the USA famously, France, China on multiple occasions, invasions. Quite a large Asian country not involved in this. New Zealand also not included. Strange, as they're normally quite closely tied to Australia and sort of ANZAC. But yeah, this has just sort of been floated, I believe, and there's been some discussions over this. But given that it includes the USA and their position on China and entering into sort of a firm NATO-style agreement, I imagine this is very sort of early stages, and so it'd be interesting to see if this goes anywhere. But I just thought that was interesting. It pops up in the news and the list of countries that were involved. Now, we mentioned previously that the DPFP has entered into sort of a issue-by-issue potential finance agreement with the LDP, which is very positive for the LDP, because even though they have Komeito on side, they don't quite have majority in Parliament, and technically I believe it's a hung Parliament, although they have sort of formed a minority government. But getting the DPFP on side to support them is very significant, and it bodes well for them getting some legislation through. And I believe the current state of play of that is that the DPFP are wanting tax cuts, as we've talked about previously, as like a key concession. That's something they promised in their election. That's something they want to deliver for people to show they're honouring their word and their manifesto in return for supporting the LDP, who were their opponent in the election. And so it looks like that's going to go through to some extent, but that could have an effect on effectively balancing the books, like the priority the LDP might have of sort of balancing their financial commitments has taken a bit of a hit as a result of that. So that's interesting, that their efforts to sort of tighten Japanese spending, balance the books, has taken a hit, and their priority now is to just get this finance bill through and offer some tax cuts, which might obviously be a nice shot in the arm for the Japanese economy and boost spending and help the average Japanese citizen. But this new economic package, the knock-on effect of it could be that it's going to disrupt their decarbonisation efforts of Japan, and it's getting the government back in the black will take a bit of a hit as they're sort of focusing on these tax cuts. So it'd be interesting to see if that's a long-term trend and how long it takes sort of the LDP to get their agenda in that respect going to balance the books. On a similar note, it's sort of interesting that the election was triggered largely by the LDP slush fund scandal, where there was funds that weren't sort of potentially appropriately declared, and they were sort of able to sort of use the slush fund to fund candidates of their choosing at will, potentially. And it wasn't, like I say, there wasn't full disclosure with this. That scandal was like a major, along with the church scandal, was a major component of triggering that election. So I thought potentially campaign finance reform might be a key thing that sort of the LDP might be willing to consider, that other parties might be pushing for. It looks like that might not be immediately going through because there's been sort of an impasse or a difference of opinion on this. So I believe the state of play is that different Japanese political parties are now at odds over whether to have an agreement on restructuring how corporations are able to fund Japanese elections. So I believe the LDP or I thought they might be sort of pressured to sort of show they're willing to reform and move forward after this slush fund scandal. But I believe their position is that they're not opposed to companies voluntarily making contributions as sort of I guess suppose you could call it their contributions to society. You'd call it they're contributing to political discourse. So they don't want to discourage them having the freedom to fund political parties or making donations as sort of their involvement in the sort of the political system. Komeito, I believe, and the DPFP sort of middle of the road. I think they're open to it, whereas the ones very much calling it for are the Constitution Party, who you imagine the main opposition, the main opponents of the LDP. They're very much calling for LDP to put this on the table. But I believe there's sort of been a bit of an impasse in negotiating the political funds control law. And there's a bit of a wide gap on what the sort of a consensus agreement might be on sort of reforming the existing law and changing how corporations are allowed to contribute to elections and donate to political parties and sort of political discourse. So I think that possibly because of that disagreement, this sort of might get kicked down the road. It might not be the biggest priority, just simply because the parties can't agree. And so, although it seemed from the election, this might be a sort of a very pivotal thing that might get changed in this parliament, and that still could still come to pass. At the moment, there's not been agreement, so it sort of might be, like I say, the DPFP have made these financial agreements with LDP to support them on certain financial issues. So, sort of a focus might be more on sort of financial legislation, budgetary decisions, and this sort of campaign party finance law discussions might get kicked down the road, although at the first during the campaign this seemed to be very pivotal. So we'll have to see where that goes and if any sort of agreement will come to pass, and if the LDP politically could potentially be forced to be more open to this, but we'll see where that goes. Another interesting story I'd like to cover is sort of a freedom of speech, freedom of assembly issue which has popped up in Japan. And we haven't talked about this as much as other issues, but obviously immigration is a key discussion point in Japan. Parties have differing stances on it, different approaches to where Japan should go with immigration. And obviously this is very much a large future concern because of Japan's low birth rate, the economy, and generally, as with many Western economies, and Japan also has sort of potentially an aging population. And so getting immigration in to sort of fill key roles and working positions is something that's always a concern, and sort of the balance of social payments, that sort of thing, very much like the UK. This has come about because I believe a number of people from a Kurdish background have emigrated to Japan in recent years. And there was a planned demonstration against this where people were going to sort of have an anti-immigration demonstration to sort of voice their opposition to this politically. Now, a court in Saitama has blocked this protest, and they've described this as hate speech, and they've blocked, at least in the short term, this demonstration going ahead. So this is sort of very interesting for what it says about how you balance safety versus hate speech and freedom of speech, and also what it says about the future of the immigration issue in Japan. For the moment, I believe the court has just prohibited this demonstration from going ahead, and they've set like a radius banning demonstrations from where you can sort of have protests and placards and distribute leaflets against this. And this barrier is being placed around the Japan Kurdish Cultural Association in Kawaguchi in Saitama Prefecture, but they've banned that within this radius. This was planned for November the 24th, but now that's been blocked. And so it will be interesting to see where the discussion about freedom of speech and immigration on this goes from here. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting that it got to such a point that the court was forced to get involved and sort of raise safety and hate speech concerns to sort of block the demonstration. Now, we've sort of covered a few sort of issues of the week, of things that have popped up that I found interesting in sort of Japan's political life. But now I'd sort of like to go again into sort of a longer issue. Last week we talked about this SAPG, the Conservative Party of Japan. Now I'd sort of like to interestingly go in the other direction, talk about sort of a left-wing populist party as opposed to a right-wing one. So I'd like to talk about Reiwa. Now, Reiwa, I suppose you could compare them to Jeremy Corbyn in the UK or Bernie Sanders in the US when he was running, sort of a left-wing populist party. And their origin is that we've talked in the past about the DPFP, we talked about them earlier, and they've sort of potentially forming a sort of loose agreement with LDP, the main party of Japan. They formed out of what used to be the Liberal Party. That's a former party of Japan. And what I believed happened, that the party agreed to sort of merge with what now is the DPFP, which is sort of a centrist party. But I believe Reiwa was formed out of largely sort of more left-wing elements of what was the Liberal Party. So sort of an old left-wing party. The centrists moved over to DPFP, and the more left-wing elements, unhappy with that decision, they've now largely formed a big block of what is now Reiwa. They're also interesting in that they're led by a former actor, Taro Yamamoto. I know him best, and perhaps his best known film is Battle Royale. It's a fantastic film, love Battle Royale. It's a great film. It's based on a book, which also is very good. Essentially about it's a sort of a dystopian novel where a group of teenagers are placed in an island and forced to fight for their survival. And I believe he plays sort of one of the more memorable characters. He's sort of a little bit of an outsider who's not known by the main group, and he has a very pivotal role in the film. And he's gone from that, had further roles, and he's now entered politics. And again, I thought an interesting contrast. We talked about the Conservative Party of Japan last week. The leader of the Conservative Party of Japan, his pivotal element that triggered him to enter politics was the passing of the LGBT Understanding Act in Japan. That's made him essentially say, this has gone too far, I need to enter politics. Taro Yamamoto had a very similar moment, although he's, as we'll discuss, Reiwa is a very pro-LGBT party, or certainly more than the CPG. But unlike him, his sort of road to Damascus moment was he was very unhappy with sort of the way the Fukushima nuclear disaster scandal was handled, and he was just generally very upset about that whole incident in, I believe, 2011 when that happened. And as a result, he's now entered politics, and Reiwa is a very anti-nuclear party. And this Taro Yamamoto is a very interesting character. He's been involved in a couple of interesting incidents. One that stood out was this letter to the Emperor incident, where he was at a gathering of politicians where the Emperor of Japan, or at least his representatives, were present. And he wrote a letter, which I believe it's been stated contained his concerns about the way Fukushima was handled. I believe this is before he was in Reiwa, or Reiwa was as prominent. He wrote a letter stating his concerns about Fukushima, which obviously is political, it's a non-political gathering, wrote it down and passed it to the Emperor. And obviously this is very hot button, as since the Constitution of Japan and World War II, the Emperor is not meant to be involved directly in political issues by design, and it was a non-political gathering, but he passed it to him. It's unclear, I believe, whether he actually read it or not, and this caused a bit of an outcry that he was potentially violating the Constitution, and it was just a breach of protocol, and it basically shouldn't have been done, but very sort of I suppose you could say irreverent for the status quo, very bold thing to do, you would call that. Another incident is he was involved in a protest in Parliament, where I believe the LDP were passing sort of a bill involving refugees or immigration, and he was sort of made a big protest, and he was sort of put his body on the line and was going to go get involved, and there was like this big sort of I suppose you call it a fracas in Parliament, and he had to be like held back by other people in Parliament to stop him making a sort of a protest and sort of stop proceedings. So that's quite evocative, to sort of not just oppose this bill, but to really get involved, start a big protest about it, and have to be held back by other members in Parliament. And I thought another thing, I think that I found quite interesting about it is I believe that in one election he had the chance potentially to enter Parliament because Reiwa, when entering the election, the leader Taro Yamamoto was on the list of potential candidates, where you can place your preferred candidates in a list in order, and then based on the amount of votes your party gets, you might get 5-6 representatives, and you can say, okay, well, here's my top 6 or whatever. Now you would imagine he might be very keen as an actor turned politician, the leader of the party, to be enter Parliament. But he didn't put himself first on the list. I believe he put himself third, and so he had sort of a lower preference. And the reason he did that is he wanted to make I believe, disabled or people who would require handicapped access. He put them as the party's first two representatives the highest preference. And the reason he did that, I think he wanted to get greater representation in that respect in Parliament, and also this led to them having to adapt the House of Parliament to sort of have handicap access. Now, you could say, if you're being cynical, he wants attention for himself. I take the view, I think it's quite a nice thing for him to do that, to make it more accessible in that respect. It's a nice moment, of historical moment. And also, I think, yeah, I sort of see why you might be cynical about that, but I think it would be very alluring to someone who's the head of the party, who's under pressure to sort of represent themselves, get coverage for themselves, get attention, get themselves in front of the media to sort of promote their party, get more attention. It would be very compelling upon you to want to be in the Houses of Parliament. And like you said, he's been involved in these protests and things and sort of gave big controversial incidents where he gets attention. You'd think in Parliament he'd be very keen to get himself in there, but he chose not to do that and put this as like a higher priority, which I think is potentially quite nice. So anyway, in terms of the electoral result, now Reiwa, in the most recent election, 2024, they have a much significant representation, and it's sort of, like I said, of these new right-wing parties that have entered, Asian NATO and the Conservative Party for Japan, who have 3 seats each. This could be something for them to look at, although they're right-wing populists, obviously, because the left-wing populists, Reiwa, they had 3 seats, but they've now tripled that to 9 seats, which is in the fractured Japan parliament we have now, where there's a hung parliament, a minority government. That could be a very significant bloc. So to triple their votes as they did in the last election says that potentially Reiwa has staying power, that their message is getting through, and that's a very, very significant bloc. As I say, it's a significant increase in their number of seats. So quite impressive for them to do that in the last election. They've gone from 3 to 9 House of Representative members. So in terms of their previous election performance, as I say, they previously had 3 seats in the House of Representatives. That was in their 2021 election, their first election. They fielded 21 candidates, got in 3, and they, as I say, tripled that. Fielded a great number of candidates, 35 candidates, to get 9 representatives in the House of Representatives in 2024. And in terms of votes in constituency, they went up very significantly. They went up from about 248,000 to 425,000. And in terms of the PR non-constituency votes, they went from 2.2 million votes to 3.8. So that's a very significant increase. They've gone to nearly 7% of the total vote there. So that really puts them on the map in terms of having a significant base of support. Other elections that perhaps might be worth considering, in the House of Councillors, the upper house, have 5 out of 248 representatives. They previously were on 2, so they have a bit of a presence there as well. And interestingly, in the Tokyo election in 2020, so this was sort of before they first entered the House of Representatives in the 2021 election, they got 657,000 votes in that. Vote for governor, 10%, and they finished 3rd, which I think is very respectable before they even had this presence in the House of Representatives. As I say, it's sort of quite a new party. So that was quite a significant result for them, I think, looking at it. And another interesting thing about the results is that unlike the CPJ, the Conservative Party for Japan, which is sort of a very much a regional focused power in terms of where they draw support, they're very focused on Nagoya. It's interesting that Reiwa is, I think, a little bit more broader spread in terms of where they draw their support and where their councillors and where their House of Representatives candidates have been elected in, which is more interesting about them. I suppose the sort of that left-wing populist message is sort of spread and has a certain amount of support in different areas. Now, in terms of the policies of Reiwa, one thing they're very prominent on is they want to get rid of the consumption tax. So tax on goods, they see that as sort of, I suppose, as sort of a left-wing populist party, they see that as hurting people on lower incomes more, and as that sort of being like non-progressive way of taxing people. So they want to essentially get rid of the consumption tax and instead get taxation from other areas. They want to raise the pension amounts, and they want to reduce social insurance premiums. That's very good for pensioners and people on low incomes who can't work anymore, who are sort of retired. So it's sort of quite progressive in that sense. And they want a sort of a seasonal inflation benefit. And I believe this is to counter out sort of rising inflation in Japan at certain times. They want to offer people money at times when prices rise or where there's higher inflation, and sort of hand in hand with that, they also want sort of fuel payments and benefits to pay for heating, which is sort of a similar issue we have in the UK. We recently means tested in the UK fuel benefit payments. And Reiwa are very strong on sort of paying more to prevent sort of pensioner poverty, fuel poverty, that sort of thing. Also, very interestingly, they want to increase sort of the fishery and forestry industry to make sort of Japan more self-sufficient with food. And I thought that's quite interesting because it sort of stood out as being something similar to the Populist Party, the CPJ, but sort of coming at it from different, I suppose, angles. I suppose Reiwa, they want to secure the supply of food, I suppose you'd say, for people, and to have people feel secure in that, and to be less exposed to inflation and to sort of supply issues. But I suppose at the end of the day, it's the same thing. They both want to strengthen those industries. They want to also, as I've alluded to in the past, Taro Yamamoto's big political moment was his displeasure at the way Fukushima happened and the way that it was responded to. They're sort of very much an anti-nuclear party. That's a big part of their platform. And they also want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well. So I suppose they lean more into renewables potentially. And as well as being opposed to nuclear energy, they're also sort of very much in favour of peaceful diplomacy. They don't want Japan to be entirely reliant on the US for their personnel on Japan and their bases, but they want to sort of lean more into sort of being peaceful. They don't want unnecessary build-up of the military. But they are against nuclear weapons as well as general military build-up. So anti-nuclear in terms of nuclear weapons. They want sort of Japan to lead the path on sort of nuclear proliferation, getting rid of nuclear weapons, and also be anti-nuclear in terms of power. I suppose more from the Fukushima aspect. And so you can sort of see why, given Japan's history with Fukushima and its history with nuclear power in that respect, why nuclear is quite a hot button, and sort of some parties are opposed to it. And it's a bit more of a controversial issue than it would be perhaps in some countries where they hadn't had incidents like that. And finally, also, they're sort of, as I've alluded to, more pro-LGBT rights, as compared to other parties. They're quite open about that, being pro-LGBT. And also, a political position I believe Reiwa have is that they're sort of less anti-immigration. He sort of put his body on the line, Taro Yamamoto, by hurting himself and making a big protest during the passing of an anti-refugee bill, which would allow Japan to sort of enable them to deport people who overstayed their visa. And so sort of that anti-refugee bill caused him to make a big protest. So I believe that would be their political stance generally as well, sort of less anti-immigration than some parties like CPJ, for example. So that rounds out the political news. In terms of any other news, I've got an issue that is sort of bordering politics, but I wasn't quite sure if it would, you could call it political or not. So it certainly has political implications. This is concerning Uniqlo. They, I believe, announced recently that they would not use cotton from certain parts of Western China where there's sort of labour and sort of human rights concerns. So Uniqlo announced that publicly, that they do not source their cotton from there. And that's led to sort of a big backlash, online backlash in China. There's been talk of a boycott as a result. And it's interesting because China's significant to Uniqlo, which is a big Japanese retailer. We have it here in the UK as well, and I believe it's a sort of a global brand. It's important for them not only in terms of it being a big market where they sell their clothes, but it's also very important for their manufacturing. So sort of the implications of what happens with this boycott and what might happen, whether they might have to close stores as a result of this, whether the Chinese government will get involved. The implications of this, I think, will be very interesting. And I picked this because I think it's interesting not only in terms of the story itself, but also I think it's sort of maybe sort of the first flash of tension, maybe. Perhaps I'm reading too much into this, between China and Japan in the wake of Trump being voted in and sort of these tariff concerns. Certainly I think it's very interesting that this story came out around this time, so I just picked that because I thought it was quite interesting. But yeah, that about rounds up the show, guys. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Sayonara, everyone. Goodbye.